Welcome back. How many of you during your entire educational careers have ever had a section about learning how to learn? I ask this question all the time to my athletes and performing artists and college students, and maybe 20% of them raise their hands that they have learned how to learn and learned how to learn throughout their unique learning styles. Furthermore, within your specific performance area, whether it's acting or singing, playing a musical instrument, individual sports, team sports, have you ever had a teacher or a coach talk about how you learn the skills, how you integrate the skills? Few have ever done that. Over the last 15 years, beside the branch of psychology called positive psychology, there is a whole branch called neuroscience or neuropsychology. And it's primarily looking at how the brain functions, dispelling some old myths about the brain, about having parts or sections to it. What we're finding out right now, the brain is really a series of wires, of wiring connections. For example, that there are about 100 billion neurons in the brain. Neurons are their own mini computer, about 100 billion of neurons in the brain, each neuron with its at least 1,000 synapses, connections to it. So you can see how wide and extensive this wiring system is in our brains. It's been said that there are about 1 quadrillion, I can't conceptualize that number, connections, which is about equal to all the stars and all the galaxies of the universe. That's how much is going on in our brains right now. Our brain consumes about 20% of our metabolism. This super computer in our brains is responsible for how we function, but also our character and our performances as well. In our first V101 video of this series, I talked about there is a distinction between learning, input, retention, memory, and output, performing. Each is interdependent. Each has its own separate emphases, dynamics, and functions. I want to talk to you just a little bit today about how you learn, which lends itself to how you recall or retain information, conceptual information, as well as physical information. And of course, this whole series has been on that third leg, the output, the human performance. We learn in many ways. And from our last video together, I talked about developing and honoring your unique personality for your performance areas, as well as learning in general. Remember the letters NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, that you are either predominantly a predominant neurological orientation of visual or auditory or kinesthetic. This particularly applies to how we learn best. For example, visuals need to take notes or make pictures or look at graphs or flip charts or PowerPoint slides. Sometimes they may use to write their notes and review their notes. They carefully check instructions that are written in the guidelines. They need to have visual connections. Auditory people need to hear the sounds of their voice, saying aloud a concept or a word, or indeed even a foreign language. Sometimes if you are reading a manual or some kind of training piece, read it out loud, that you can actually hear your voice, but actually feel the vibrations of it. If you're learning new words or new concepts or creating an acronym for your performance, say it and repeat it to yourself multiple times. Auditories need to hear what you're saying. And then finally, kinesthetic, the action sensing folks need to take notes as you listen to instructions. You carefully think about how you're going to implement that, how you feel about that, what you sense about those things. So the more you key in to your predominant neurological learning style, visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, the more you can make learning easier. Hopefully that makes some sense. Let me talk a little bit right now about what neuroscience is starting to develop and define about how we learn. These neurons are mini computers, each with its own web, each with its own series of connections. Interestingly, they've identified in the last 6-7 years now what are called mirror neurons, mirroring what you see. If you're viewing somebody in your sports or art field that is super proficient in what they do, really observe them. What you are doing is engaging mirror neurons to see the same thing and to feel the same thing within yourself. Even if you don't view these, your each time new information comes in, it stimulates individual neurons into neural nets. And those things start what's called reverberate. And what happens is that they're starting to make a connection from your lateral prefrontal cortex to a little organ within your brain that is called the hippocampus. It's just a little organ deep inside your brain. And the hippocampus is responsible for anchoring new information and allowing it to connect with old information. Each time you see something or repeat something to yourself, these initial neurons, mirror neurons or regular neurons, start making a little movements and reverberating in microseconds, in mini millimeters. And then it starts connecting, making synapses to the hippocampus. And each time you repeat this, these connections are what neuroscientists call reverberate, make them stronger or heavier. Each time you mentally rehearse that, each time you physically rehearse something, that array of neurons becomes more connected to the hippocampus, and the hippocampus in return starts responding to those initial neural sets. That's how you learn something. It is implying that you repeat things, you rehearse things, even basic things, that your synapses become stronger or heavier the more you repeat those, either mentally repeat those or physically repeat those. Therefore, your brain is on your side. Think back to when you were in school, whether it's currently in school or decades ago. Did you ever pull an all-nighter? Did you ever cram for something? Interestingly, those are the worst two things you can do to ensure any kind of long-term memory. When our brains reverberate with the neural connections, it lends itself going from short-term memory into long-term memory. And when you cram things too fast and not repeat them long enough over a period of time, and when you don't rest a lot, because what neuroscientists are just recently discovering, when you rest, when you sleep in deep rapid eye movement sleep, REM sleep, is that your brain with the hippocampus is doing its major reverberating, and that's where you're learning that stuff. That's where you're anchoring those things within you, so that if you're cramming for an exam, pushing hard for some kind of performance with lack of sleep, you're doing the worst things you can do against yourselves. Okay? Any kind of learning should follow this sequence: whole, parts, whole learning. As you do, whether it's reading a textbook or doing some kind of practice with your sport or with your piano or violin. Start out the practice session, start out the learning session, looking at the whole, what is to be achieved, what is the big picture, what it is connected to what you've previously worked on or learned. Then break it down into specific parts, steps, stages, sequences, components. Okay? And then at the end of the session, which most people do not do, is tie it back into the whole, back to the big picture. That's where integration happens. Interestingly, one of the things that early biologists and neurologists found out is that the brain seems to respond better in terms of memorizing things, in terms of chunking information, the parts that are chunked either into threes or into sevens. For some reason, it's easier for the brain for us to grasp things that are in threes or those that are in sevens, which makes sense. How many digits in your local phone number? And what's connecting those? It's either a dash or a dot. 3 and then 4. In the 1950s, when we started having to come up with the need to have area codes, AT&T, the old Ma Bell, found out that we should keep on chunking and then chunking the area code into threes. Area code 3, dash or dot, 3 prefix, 4 the remainder of it. That's how we chunk things, is in the threes or sevens. In a training session, after you figure out the whole of what is to achieve, then chunk it into specific elements. Usually in a practice session, no more than 3, sometimes 7 near the end of your training cycle. But chunk it into 3 components or steps or stages or sequences and work on each. And then at the end of the training session, putting those back together into the whole. Few people do that. I'm a great believer, as we'll talk about in the next video on smart and purposeful practice, that if you take the last 15, 18% of your time at the end of the training session, while you're still pretty fresh, you tend to anchor those back into the whole so they have their connections. Hopefully this is making some sense to you. You see, the brain only does 4 things. It sorts information, what's relevant, what's not relevant, what may be relevant, and how to sort that out. It stores it away and starts making connections with what is already there. And then after the connections have been repeated and reinforced, strengthened, those connections, then your brain retrieves those and then apply those. That's all the brain does. Now, this goes back to your filter, which are you visual, auditory, or kinesthetic? And do you use those to help you input and connect? This also goes to what I mentioned in the last video. Are you typically a thinker or are you a feeler? This is not only useful in your performance areas, the output, those are also helpful for the input and the retention areas of it. Here's something that you might, old people will understand this one. Did you remember when you used to have a single lens reflex camera, SLR camera, without the mini computers in it, and you were taking a photo? Is that photography teachers back then said you should learn how to bracket that of looking at not only the speed and the exposures, bracket it at high level, and then take another picture at a low level, and then start taking some pictures within the brackets. That's how it makes the transition into retrieving that, seeing what things apply. Learning can be fun. It can't, when it's looked at as drudgery or a penalty, we don't learn to retain. We're not actively involved with this. This is such a neat poem by O.B. Shallow. He says, make learning fun. He said, fun creates enjoyment. Enjoyment invites participation. Participation focuses on attention. Attention expands awareness. Awareness promotes insight. Insight generates knowledge, and knowledge yields proficiency. Part of that is when you're having fun, you are relaxed enough to accept the information, to become immersed in the information. I'm hoping a lot of this starts making some sense, giving you some new insights to how we learn and learn to make it the connections between short-term memory and long-term memory. That's through active repetition, allowing those synapses to reverberate with the hippocampus, and that communication goes on and makes them stronger or heavier, more permanent connections. Just being exposed to something for the first time isn't good enough to improve learning, and especially for motor learning. These are separate processes. Going back and honoring what I'm saying about the whole parts, whole learning, go back and think about, if you're actively a student, look at one of your textbooks now. The best textbooks that are written understand this concept of whole parts, whole learning. Look at the structure of a textbook or even a nonfiction book, is that they will usually give a preview, an introduction, an overview. Then they will go into specific sections, chunked either into 3s or 7s. And then they will, at the end, give a summary or a review, or have you ever considered types of questions, or access to different types of websites for further information so that you can repeat those things. Particularly at different times of your academic career or your playing career, review, literally review this video on how you learn, how you stay engaged. Your first and primary component of learning is that you are responsible for your own learning. Nobody teaches you. Even though you have concerned and dedicated parents or coaches or teachers, you are still responsible for your own learning. You cannot blame equipment. You cannot blame teammates. No, it's you are responsible for your own learning. When I would have a team athlete come up to me and said, "Coach said I should ask you this," they're not taking responsibility for their learning. Is that you take responsibility for your learning. Learning, as you found out, is fun. It is fun to learn to know these things and learn to remember these things. And then you can start integrating that into how to practice these, how to refine these, so that you start performing better. Be involved in your learning. Pay your best personality characteristics into your own learning. And it will become, like anything else, easier and easier. This huge neural net here of billions of connections is based on your active learning in your early 20s and until your brain formally and fully completes its development in about mid-20s. It's what you do to yourself and based on your attitudes to keep on learning. Review this at some point. Think about how you best learn in your performance areas. You don't have to be just a thinker. Feelers can step back and say, what do I need to feel as I am acquiring these skills, as I'm practicing these skills, and then as I'm performing these skills. Make learning fun, make learning involved for yourself, and you will start becoming the kind of student or athlete or performing artist that you've ever dreamed. Then it starts becoming easy. I shall see you next time when I talk about purposeful practice.